She heard every word. That was the part that broke her. Not the words themselves, but the calm in his voice when he said them. No hesitation, no pause, like she was a variable in an equation he'd already solved. Kang Min-jae, the man whose name made grown men lower their eyes, the man who had built an empire out of silence and consequence. He stood in that private hallway at the Meridian Grand with a glass of bourbon in his hand and told his associate without blinking, if Nia left tomorrow, life would go on. And Nia Brooks, 8 months pregnant, wearing a dress she'd spent 3 weeks choosing, carrying his child in her body, stood just around that corner and heard it all. She didn't scream, she didn't cry. She pressed one hand flat against the marble wall and breathed. That was the moment everything changed. If you've ever given everything to someone who made you feel like nothing, this story is for you. Stay until the end, hit the like button, and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Subscribe so you never miss what comes next, because this one's going to stay with you. Plus, the night of the Meridian Gala had started the way most of their evenings started, with distance dressed up as elegance. Nia sat at the vanity in their suite on the 41st floor, watching Min-jae adjust his cufflinks in the mirror without once looking at her reflection. He was thinking about something. He was always thinking about something. She'd learned to read the set of his jaw the way other women read weather. When it was tight like that, square and deliberate, she knew he was already somewhere else before they'd even left the room. "You look beautiful," he said. He said it the way you say thank you to a server at a restaurant. Automatic, correct, gone. Nia looked at herself in the mirror. Her shoulders were bare, her dress the color of deep wine, and her stomach was round and full and impossible to ignore. She was 8 months along. 8 months of this man putting his hand on her belly at night and then disappearing into phone calls before sunrise. 8 months of assembling a nursery, mostly alone. 8 months of telling herself that this was the trade, that the life he'd given her required this kind of patience, this kind of quiet. She told herself that tonight would be different. She almost believed it. The Meridian Grand was the kind of building that announced itself before you arrived. 32 floors of glass and black marble, a lobby that felt more like a cathedral than a hotel, staffed by people trained to look through you and at you at the exact same time. The charity gala occupied the entire 42nd floor ballroom, and the guest list read like someone had combined 3 different worlds that had no business being in the same room together. City councilmen in rented tuxedos, tech money in deliberately casual blazers, real estate families who'd owned Manhattan for 3 generations, and then, scattered through the room like dark threads in expensive fabric, the people who moved the kind of money that never appeared on any financial disclosure. Min-jae moved through it all with the ease of someone who had never once doubted where he belonged. People shifted when he walked, not dramatically, not visibly. It was the kind of adjustment you made without knowing you were making it, a half step to the side, a slight turn of the shoulder, a drink raised to the lips right at the moment he passed, fear doing its job invisibly. Nia moved beside him and smiled at people she barely knew and accepted glasses of sparkling water and answered questions about the baby with warmth she mostly felt. Because even in the middle of everything she was carrying emotionally, the baby was real and the love for the baby was real, and some feelings didn't require excavation. A woman named Petra Voss, blonde, 50s, the kind of philanthropist whose charity work was partly genuine and partly reputation management, squeezed Nia's hand and told her she was glowing. "You look like someone who's figured something out," Petra said. Nia smiled. "Or like someone who just needs to sit down." Petra laughed. Nia laughed. Min-jae was already 3 feet away, shaking hands with a man whose name Nia had never been told. That was how the first hour went. By the second hour, Nia's feet were aching in the way that felt less like discomfort and more like her body delivering a verdict. She excused herself from a conversation about a waterfront development project she had no investment in and drifted toward the corridor that ran alongside the ballroom, a long, carpeted hallway lined with dark wood paneling and doors that led to private dining rooms reserved for a different tier of the evening's guests. She wasn't going anywhere in particular. She just needed 2 minutes without someone looking at her stomach. She was maybe 20 feet into the corridor, her hand trailing along the wall for support, when she heard Min-jae's voice through one of the half-open doors. She stopped. Not because she was eavesdropping, she stopped because you stop when you hear the voice of someone you love coming from a room you didn't know they were in. The man speaking with him was Song Dai-jung. She recognized the rough, smoke-worn texture of it. Song was one of Min Jae's oldest associates, a man who'd been with him since the early years, before the penthouse and the lawyers and the charitable donations made in the organization's name. Song laughed the way old soldiers laugh, like everything is a little funny because everything is a little terrible. "The wife looks good," Song said. "Big belly and all. You're almost a family man, boss." Min Jae said something low that she couldn't catch. "I'm serious," Song said. "What happens when the baby comes? She's going to want more of your time. Women like that, the good ones, they expect things." There was a pause. The kind of pause that in another context might mean consideration, reflection, weighing. "And what if she gets tired of waiting?" Song added. "What if she decides to go?" Nia's hand was flat against the wall. She wasn't breathing. Min Jae's answer came without a beat of hesitation, delivered in the same measured, even tone he used to discuss shipment logistics and rival syndicate movements. If Nia left tomorrow, life would go on. The world didn't end. That was the strange thing. The music continued from the ballroom. Somewhere distant, someone laughed at something. The chandeliers didn't fall. The floor didn't open. Nia stood in that corridor and felt something shift inside her chest. Not dramatically, not the way it happens in stories, but quietly, like a load-bearing beam finally giving way after a very long time under very heavy weight. She had spent 8 months convincing herself she was loved, specifically, that out of all the things Min Jae had built and controlled and owned, she was the one thing he held differently, that whatever complicated territory they occupied, his world, his danger, his walls, she was inside them, and that meant something. If Nia left tomorrow, life would go on. She pushed off the wall and walked back toward the ballroom, slowly, one hand on her stomach. She did not confront him. She understood something right there in that corridor that she hadn't understood before. Confrontation would only give him the opportunity to explain the statement away, to soften it, to turn her reaction into the problem. And she was tired. Not the tired of one night, but the tired of a long accumulation. And she did not want to spend one more ounce of herself managing his version of their story. She smiled at Petra Voss on the way back in. She accepted another glass of sparkling water. She stood beside Min Jae for the remainder of the evening and said the appropriate things, and laughed in the right moments, and touched his arm once when a photograph was taken. He never noticed that anything had changed. That was, in its own way, the second answer to the question she hadn't known she was asking. Huck. The car ride home was silent in the specific way their silences had become. Not uncomfortable, exactly, but hollow. Min Jae scrolled through his phone with one hand, his other arm resting on the window ledge, watching the city move past in a way that suggested he was processing something entirely unrelated to the woman beside him. Nia watched the city too, but she was doing a different kind of math. She was counting. Not the months of the marriage or the weeks of the pregnancy, but the smaller things. The dinners interrupted before the second course, the conversation she'd started that ended when his phone rang. The night she'd felt the baby kick for the first time and turned to tell him and found him already on his way out of the room. The plan she'd mentioned that he'd agreed to without absorbing, so that later, when they didn't happen, he didn't even know what had been lost. She thought about her mother who'd told her once, years ago, before Min Jae, before New York, before all of it, that you know a relationship is in trouble not when someone does something terrible, but when you stop expecting them to show up. Nia had stopped expecting. She'd done it so gradually she hadn't noticed the moment it happened. At the penthouse, Min Jae poured a glass of water, checked 3 messages on his encrypted phone, and came to bed at an hour that suggested the night had been more eventful in his mind than in the room they shared. He kissed her temple. He told her to sleep. He was out within minutes. Nia lay on her side, her hand on her stomach, and stared at the dark. She didn't cry. She'd moved past the kind of grief that comes out in tears. She was somewhere else now, somewhere more clarifying and more terrifying, which was the place where you finally accept what's true and have to decide what to do with that acceptance. She thought about the studio. 3 years ago, before Mean Jay, before she'd allowed herself to be folded into his world, she had almost signed a lease on a space in the Flatbush section of Brooklyn, a wide-windowed second-floor loft above a dry cleaner, with good light and enough room to run art classes for the kids in the neighborhood whose families couldn't afford enrichment programs. She'd built the whole thing in her mind. The Saturday morning classes, the smell of paint, children carrying home something they'd made themselves. She'd let it go when she moved in with Min Jae. It had seemed like a reasonable exchange at the time. She wondered if that space was still available. She fell asleep thinking about square footage. Then, in the morning, she looked. She didn't know what she expected to find. The listing gone, the building sold, some conclusive sign that the door was closed and had been closed for a long time. Instead, she found that the space above the dry cleaner in Flatbush was available, had been available for several months, and was asking a monthly rent she could manage from her own accounts, the ones she'd maintained quietly throughout the marriage, not from suspicion, but from a stubbornness about financial independence that now felt, for the first time, like genuine foresight. She closed the laptop, made coffee, stood at the window and watched the city below and tried to locate any feeling inside herself that resembled hesitation. She found very little. She made an appointment. She didn't tell Min Jae, not because she was hiding it, not yet, but because by then she'd internalized what would happen if she mentioned it. He would nod. He would say something like, "That sounds good," or "We can talk about it this weekend." The phone would ring, and the things she'd said would dissolve into the air of whatever room they were standing in, absorbed by the walls, gone. She'd stopped giving him things to absorb. She went to see the studio on a Tuesday, while Min Jae was in a meeting that had apparently required the presence of 4 lawyers and 2 men whose names she'd never been told. She took the subway, a choice that would have startled his security detail if they'd known, but they didn't know because she didn't tell them. And there was something clarifying about sitting in a subway car among ordinary people going ordinary places. The studio was better than she remembered from the listing photos. The light was real, east-facing, morning light, the kind that made things look possible. The floors were unfinished wood that would need work. The walls needed paint. One of the window frames had a long crack running diagonally that would need to be assessed before winter. She stood in the middle of the empty room and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. She felt like herself, not Min Jae's wife, not the woman at the gala who smiled and stood and accepted sparkling water, not the pregnant woman who'd learned to read tension in the set of her husband's jaw. Just herself. In a room that could become something she chose. She sat down on the floor because her back was aching and her feet were done, and she didn't care even slightly about the dust on her clothes. She sat there for a while and thought about the children she'd teach here and the mothers who might bring them, and the work she'd do that no one would pay attention to because it wasn't the kind of work that made people shift when you walked past them. She thought that this was fine. This was better than fine. She signed the initial paperwork on the way out. The weeks that followed were the strangest of their marriage. Strange because on the surface, nothing had changed. Nia still moved through the penthouse. She still ate the meals prepared by the household staff. She still sat beside Min Jae at the occasional event, still deflected questions about the baby with warmth, still slept on her side of their bed. But she was building something. Quietly, steadily, with the focused attention she'd always had but had for too long directed outward. She hired a contractor through a reference she trusted, a woman she'd known in college whose husband did renovation work, and didn't ask questions she didn't want to answer. The studio was gutted gently, floors refinished, walls repainted in a warm off-white that would hold children's artwork without competing with it, the cracked window frame replaced, a small office partitioned at the back where she could manage administrative work and eventually store supplies. She researched nonprofit incorporation. She reached out to 2 organizations she admired that ran similar programs in other boroughs. She designed a basic curriculum, rough and adjustable, and built around the understanding that children needed more open space than instruction. She opened a separate account at a bank across the city from the one Min Jae used. She moved money into it methodically, not dramatically, not the kind of withdrawal that would flag anything or raise questions, amounts that lived beneath attention. Over 3 weeks, it became enough. She found an apartment 2 blocks from the studio, second floor, a bedroom and a half. A kitchen with a window. It was not the penthouse. It was not 41 floors above the city. It was the kind of apartment that had a radiator that made noise and neighbors who played music on weekend mornings. She paid the deposit. She had not cried once since the night of the gala. She wasn't certain what to make of that. She thought about it one evening while Minjae sat across the dinner table from her, his phone face down in the performance of a man trying to be present, and she realized the answer was simple. She wasn't grieving something she'd lost. She was building something she'd found. That was different. That had always been different. Minjae noticed the silence before he noticed anything else. Not the silence of a quiet house. The penthouse was never truly quiet, not with the city humming 41 floors below and the security rotation cycling through the lobby and the kitchen staff arriving before 6 to begin the day's preparation. He was used to all of that. He'd built his life inside that particular kind of noise and learned to read it like a second language. What he noticed was the silence that came from Nia. It had been 3 weeks since the gala. 3 weeks in which she had been present, physically, socially, functionally, and yet somehow less available than she'd ever been. She answered questions, she ate dinner, she slept beside him. But there was something behind her eyes that had changed its angle, and he could not locate the exact moment it had shifted. He told himself it was the pregnancy. The 3rd trimester did things to women. He'd read enough to know that, had even marked certain pages in a book his mother had sent from Seoul with a note in her handwriting that said, "Pay attention. Fatigue. Emotional withdrawal. The body consuming everything available for the work of the final weeks. It was biology. It was temporary." He told himself this, and almost believed it. Almost. It was a Thursday evening when he first tried to close the distance directly. He came home earlier than usual. A meeting with a municipal contact had ended 40 minutes ahead of schedule, a small mercy from a week that had otherwise been relentless, and found Nia sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop open and a cup of tea going cold beside her. She didn't hear him come in. Or if she did, she didn't look up. He stood in the doorway for a moment. On the screen he could see what looked like a spreadsheet, columns of numbers, a floor plan thumbnail in one corner. He didn't ask. He walked to the refrigerator, poured a glass of water, and said, "You eat yet?" "I was going to." "I can have something sent up." "I'm fine." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. She closed the laptop. Not quickly, not with the sharp motion of someone hiding something, but with the deliberate pace of someone who had simply finished. She picked up her tea, registered its temperature, and set it back down. "You look tired," he said. "I am tired." "Is it the baby?" She looked at him then. Something moved across her face that he couldn't name. Not anger, not sadness exactly, more like the expression of someone who has been asked a question they've already answered privately and completely, and the asking of it now is almost beside the point. "The baby is fine," she said. "I had a checkup Tuesday. Everything is where it should be." "Tuesday." He processed that. "I didn't know you had an appointment." "I mentioned it Sunday morning." He had no memory of Sunday morning. Sunday morning had been a phone call with a lawyer in Chicago and then an in-person meeting with 2 of his operations managers about a distribution conflict that had been building for 6 weeks. He could reconstruct the Sunday morning in detail. The order of calls, the arguments made, the decisions reached. He could not reconstruct Nia mentioning a doctor's appointment. "I should have been there," he said. "You had things." "That's not—" He stopped. Started again. "I should have been there anyway." Nia looked at him with an expression that was somehow worse than anger. It was the expression of someone who has stopped being surprised. "It's fine, Minjae," she said. "It went fine." And there it was. The specific way she said fine that meant something was anything but, and had probably not been fine for longer than he'd understood. He'd heard that word from her before, in better days, and it had sounded different. Warmer. More like fine meaning truly fine. Now it had the texture of a door closing from the inside. He wanted to push. He had built an entire career on not letting things rest when they needed to be pressed. But there was something about the way she sat, hands folded on the table, shoulders back, not pulling away but not reaching toward him either, that told him pressing right now would be the wrong instrument for this particular problem. I'll be home early tomorrow, he said. Okay. We can have dinner. Together. No phones. She looked at him again, then she nodded once. Okay, she said again. Same word, different weight. He went to bed before her that night, which was unusual, and lay in the dark and tried to locate the feeling that was sitting in the center of his chest. It wasn't fear. He knew fear well enough to identify it. It was something more unfamiliar than that, the specific discomfort of being on the outside of something you thought you were inside of. He didn't sleep well. The dinner didn't happen. He had intended for it to happen. He had, in fact, told 2 people to reschedule a 6 o'clock call so the evening would be clear, an act that cost him more social capital than he would have spent on most things. He'd even told the kitchen staff what Nia preferred: the lamb she liked, the specific rice preparation, the soup she'd been eating more of in the 3rd trimester. At 5:40, Song Dae-jung called. There was a problem with a warehouse transfer in Red Hook, a discrepancy in a manifest that, if not resolved before morning, would create exposure he couldn't afford. Song was at the warehouse. The contact they needed was only available by phone for the next 90 minutes. The thing required Min Jae's voice, his authority, his specific knowledge of an agreement made 2 years ago that no one else in the organization had been present for. He took the call in the study. He told himself it would be 40 minutes. He told himself Nia would understand. She always understood. That was one of the things about her, the comprehension she extended that he had long since begun treating as a fixed resource rather than a choice she made. 2 hours later, when he emerged from the study, the dinner was on the table, covered by a cloth. Nia was in the bedroom with the door not quite closed. He lifted the cloth, looked at the food, covered it again. He knocked on the bedroom door and pushed it open. She was on the bed, her back to the door, a book open in front of her that she may or may not have been reading. Nia? I heard, she said. It's fine. That word again. It's not fine, he said. It was supposed to be. Min Jae. She said his name with a flatness that stopped him. I know, something came up. It always does. I'm not angry. She paused. I'm just tired. He stood in the doorway. He wanted to say something that would land correctly, something true and weighted enough to acknowledge the accumulation of evenings like this one. But every sentence he assembled in his mind felt inadequate before he could speak it, and the longer the silence stretched, the more she settled into the book she might not have been reading, and eventually he said, I'll make it up to you, which was the worst possible thing he could have said, and he knew it even as he said it. She turned a page. He went back to the study. Song called again at 10 that night, not about Red Hook this time. Red Hook had been resolved, barely, with less grace than Min Jae preferred. But about something else. A man named Victor Lau had been making movements in the Midtown corridor that overlapped with territory Min Jae's organization had quietly held for 7 years. Not aggressively, not yet. But the movements had a shape to them, a directional intention that Song read as a prelude to something more deliberate. He's feeling out the edges, Song said, seeing where the resistance is. Where's the resistance? Right now, thin. We've had 3 guys cycle off rotation in the last month. The Red Hook thing pulled 2 more for coverage. Talk to Juan. I want the Midtown positions reinforced by Monday. Juan's been asking for a face-to-face. He's got concerns about the West Side arrangement. Then arrange the face-to-face. He specifically asked for you, boss. Not a proxy. Min Jae said nothing for a moment. He was at his desk, a glass of bourbon at his elbow, the city visible through the window in its nighttime configuration. Bridges lit, towers glowing, traffic moving in its permanent slow arterial pulse. Monday, he said. Tell Juan Monday. And Lau? Watch him. Don't touch him, not yet. He hung up and sat for a while and thought about the empire he had spent 15 years assembling. The territories, the contacts, the arrangements with people in positions of civic authority who preferred the kind of stability Min Jae's organization provided to the chaos that came when no one was in control. He had built something durable and specific and genuinely complex, and maintaining it required exactly this. Constant attention, constant calibration, the willingness to take calls at 10 at night and make decisions that couldn't be delegated. He understood all of that. He had made peace with all of that years ago. What he was less certain about, sitting at his desk with the bourbon he wasn't really drinking, was when exactly he had made the decision, conscious or otherwise, that the empire and the woman down the hall occupied different categories of urgency, and that one could perpetually wait while the other could not. He didn't have an answer. He was not sure he'd ever asked the question before. He poured the bourbon down the small sink in the study credenza and went to bed. Nia was asleep, or performing sleep with considerable skill. He lay down beside her and did not touch her, and listened to her breathe and thought about what it would mean to lose her. The thought arrived and then dissolved before it fully formed, replaced by the more pressing geometry of Victor Lau's movements in Midtown. He fell asleep planning a defensive repositioning. 3 days later, Nia came home smelling of paint. Min-jae was in the living room when she walked in, an unusual enough position for him that she paused visibly in the entryway. He was on the couch, no phone in his hand, a cup of coffee on the table in front of him that had gone from hot to whatever the stage before cold was. "You're home," she said. "Early day." It wasn't entirely true. He'd pushed 2 things to make it happen, but it was true enough. She was carrying a tote bag over one shoulder, and her coat had a pale streak of off-white paint across the left forearm, just above the wrist. He clocked it the way he clocked everything, automatically, without appearing to. "What happened to your arm?" he said. She glanced down at the paint. Something shifted in her expression. Not guilt, not quite. More like the recalibration of someone deciding in real time how much to give. "I was helping with something," she said. "Helping with what?" "A project." She set the tote bag down. "A space. There's something I've been working on, an art studio, for kids in Flatbush." He looked at her. "Since when?" "A few weeks?" The gap between those 2 words, "a few weeks," and the total absence of any prior mention of it, opened something in the room. He felt it. He was nearly certain she felt him feel it. "You didn't tell me," he said. "I mentioned something like it, a while back." She met his eyes steadily. "You were on a call." He had no defense for that and didn't try to build one. "How far along is it?" "The renovation's almost done. I'm hoping to open in about 6 weeks. She paused. "Before the baby." He absorbed that. 6 weeks. A renovation. A lease, presumably, and contracts, and decisions about curricula and staff and the logistics of running a nonprofit in a borough he didn't have strong operational relationships in. All of it assembled without a single conversation. "Naya," he said carefully, "I know what you're going to say." "I don't think you do." "You're going to say it's a lot to take on right now, with the baby coming. You're going to say we should have talked about it. You're going to say, I was going to say I should have been there." That stopped her. She looked at him across the room with an expression he couldn't fully read. Something between surprise and something older than surprise. Something that lived in the place where hope had been filed away and not looked at in a while. "You didn't know to be there," she said quietly. "That's the problem, isn't it?" The room was very still. Outside, the city continued its operations without them. Somewhere in the building below, an elevator moved. Nia pressed her lips together. When she spoke again, her voice was level but not entirely steady. "I needed something that was mine, Min-jae. I needed to know that if everything else went away, I would still be able to point to something and say that I built that. I did that." She touched her stomach, unconsciously, the way she often did now, a reflexive reassurance directed inward. "I love you. That hasn't changed. But I've been disappearing in this life, and I don't think you've noticed. And I don't think you would have noticed for a long time." He said nothing. There was nothing to say that wouldn't sound like either a defense or a capitulation, and he was not ready for either. "I'm not trying to hurt you," she said. "I know. I'm trying to exist." She picked up the tote bag. "I'm going to shower." She walked past him toward the bedroom, and he did not reach for her, and she did not stop. And the space between them when she passed was about 18 inches and felt like considerably more. He called Song that night and told him he was unavailable until the following morning. Song was quiet for a second. "Everything okay?" "No," Min-jae said, and hung up. He sat with Nia through dinner, real dinner, neither of them pretending to be somewhere else. She told him more about the studio. He listened in the way he was not always able to listen, without organizing the information into categories of relevance, just taking it in. She talked about the kids she hoped to reach, the specific demographic of the neighborhood, the morning classes she'd designed for Saturday when parents were more likely to bring children. He watched her talk and saw something he had somehow failed to see with any consistency. She was good. Not in the vague complimentary sense he sometimes deployed, but in the actual sense, organized, thoughtful, motivated by something that had nothing to do with money or position. She cared about this in a way that was private and certain and had clearly been alive in her for a long time. He had not asked her about it. He had not, in any meaningful way, asked her about herself He tried to calculate it. The calculation was uncomfortable. "It's a good thing," he said, when she'd finished describing the curriculum structure. She looked at him carefully. "Yeah?" "It's a really good thing, Naya." She nodded once. Something in her expression softened the particular fraction that indicated it was real rather than managed. "Thank you." They went to bed, and she fell asleep against his shoulder, which she hadn't done in weeks, and he lay awake in the dark thinking about what a man does when he has been handed the evidence of his own failures in the form of everything his wife built without him. He thought about it for a long time. He did not arrive at a comfortable answer. 2 weeks before the baby was due, Min-jae came home to a penthouse that felt wrong before he cleared the entryway. It wasn't dramatic. Nothing was overturned. The rooms were all in order. The kitchen was clean, the lights on in their automatic evening sequence, the city visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows in its ordinary nighttime configuration. But there was an absence in the air that had a specific texture, the kind of absence that is not just the absence of a person, but the absence of a person's intention to return. He walked through the living room, the bedroom. He opened her closet. It took him a moment to register what he was looking at. Her clothes were there, most of them. But there were gaps, deliberate gaps, the kind made by someone who selected carefully rather than took everything, so as not to alarm before the moment was right. On the nightstand beside the lamp she preferred on the left side, there was a small envelope. His name on the front in her handwriting, the handwriting he'd watched move across grocery lists and birthday cards, and the one letter she'd written him during the first year of their marriage that he kept, for reasons he'd never fully examined, in a locked box in the study. He picked up the envelope. He didn't open it immediately. He sat on the edge of the bed, her side, and held it in both hands and felt something move through him that had no name in any of the languages he operated in. He had felt fear before. He had felt the specific fear of men who come for you in the dark, of betrayals that arrive from your closest circle, of moments when power is genuinely at risk. He knew what those feelings were and how to function through them. This was different. This was the fear of consequence. The fear of a reckoning that had been building for a long time and had finally arrived in the form of a small envelope with his name on the front. He opened it. Her handwriting was even. Careful. The letter was not long. "Min-jae, I'm not leaving because I stopped loving you. I want you to know that first because I think everything else will be harder for you to hear if you don't believe it. I'm leaving because I finally understood something I've been trying not to understand for a long time. You believe that my being here is a given, that I will always be beside you, that whatever you do or don't do, I will still be there in the morning. I heard what you said at the Meridian. I've thought about it every day since. You said life would go on if I left. I think you believe that. I think you still might. But I need you to find out if it's true. Not for me. For you. Because the man I married is capable of more than what he's become, and I'm no longer willing to make it easy for him to stay less than that. The baby will know you. I won't prevent that. But I need to be somewhere that I exist as myself, not as an extension of something you built. The studio is on Caton Avenue. That's where I'll be. I love you. That's why this is the hardest thing I've ever done. Nia, P.S. Life goes on, Min-jae. Now we both get to find out what that means. He read it twice. Then he set it down on the nightstand exactly where he'd found it, stood up, walked to the window, and looked at the city below. All those millions of lives operating at full capacity, indifferent to the specific geometry of his loss. and felt the first thing he had felt in a very long time that he could not strategize his way out of. He stood there for a long time. He did not call Song. He did not call his lawyers. He did not reach for the encrypted phone with its catalog of people who existed to solve his problems. He stood at the window with a letter in his recent memory and a closet with deliberate gaps and the specific knowledge that this, unlike every other crisis he had navigated, was something he had done entirely to himself. He reached for the wedding ring on his left hand. It was still there. His. Hers was not on the nightstand. She had taken it with her. He pressed his thumb against his own ring and felt the metal and thought about a woman who had loved him specifically. Not the empire, not the reputation, not the fear that arranged itself around him in every room he entered, but him, the specific, difficult, incomplete human being underneath all of it. He thought about what he had done with that. Downstairs, in the lobby, his security detail was running its standard rotation, unaware that the thing they'd been assigned to protect had already quietly walked out the door. He stayed at the window until the city below shifted from nighttime into the particular gray that comes before actual dawn. Not light exactly, but the absence of dark. The hour when the streets empty out completely before filling again, when New York is briefly something other than itself. Then he moved. Not with a plan. Min Jae Kang had operated on plans his entire adult life. Contingency plans, fallback positions, decision trees mapped 3 branches deep before any move was made. What moved him away from that window was something older than planning, something closer to the animal knowledge that stillness, in certain moments, is its own kind of death. He changed his shirt, poured water he didn't drink, sat at the kitchen table with Nia's letter flattened on the surface in front of him and read it a 3rd time, then a 4th, not because the words changed, but because he was looking for something in them he might have missed. Some crack in the reasoning, some opening, some place where the logic failed and could be argued back. He found none. The letter was not written by a woman in a moment of emotion. It was written by a woman who had done her thinking already, had been doing it for weeks, and had arrived at a position that was finished rather than forming. He knew the difference. He dealt in positions like that professionally. You could negotiate someone away from a position they were still assembling. You could not negotiate someone away from a position they'd already defended to themselves every day for a month. He folded the letter, put it in the pocket of the shirt he'd just changed into. He picked up the encrypted phone, put it back down. He picked up the regular phone instead and called the one number that existed in both versions of his life. Song answered on the 2nd ring, which meant he hadn't been sleeping either, or had learned over the years to sleep lightly enough that 2 rings was sufficient. "Boss?" "She's gone," Min Jae said. A silence. Song had been with him long enough to understand that certain silences required no filling. "The studio on Katon Avenue," Min Jae said. "She's there." "You want me to—" "No." The word came out with more force than he intended. He adjusted. "No, I don't want anyone near that building. You understand me? Nobody goes near her." "Understood. One's meeting is still Monday. Everything else runs as scheduled." "You sure?" "Song." "Right. Yeah. Understood." He hung up and sat in the silence that followed, and understood something that the night had taught him. The machinery of the empire would continue with or without his attention, just as Nia had continued with or without his attention, just as everything he had ever treated as a given had continued the moment it stopped requiring his active intervention. He had confused continuance with permanence for a very long time. He did not go to Katon Avenue that morning. He wanted to. The wanting had a physical component, a tightness in the chest, a pull in the direction of a specific address, that was unfamiliar enough to be genuinely uncomfortable. He was not a man who chased. He was not a man who arrived unannounced at places where he was not wanted, or at least he had never been that man with anyone who actually had the power to refuse him. Nia had that power. She had always had it. He understood that now in a way that had the specific pain of late understanding, which is different from ordinary regret because it carries the knowledge that the understanding was available earlier and you simply did not reach for it. He went to his Monday meetings instead. Juan was a compact man in his mid-40s with a stillness about him that Min Jae had always respected. The stillness of someone who does not move until he's decided, which in their line of work was either an asset or a liability, depending on what he'd decided. The West Side arrangement he wanted to discuss involved 3 buildings whose ownership had been structured through a chain of entities complex enough that only 2 people in the organization fully understood it, and one of those people was currently in a federal facility in New Jersey on an unrelated matter. The meeting lasted 90 minutes. Min Jae spoke less than he usually did. He noticed Juan noticing this but made no adjustment. At the end, when the substance was handled and the room had the loose quality of things wrapping up, Juan said, "You look like a man who didn't sleep." "I didn't." Juan said nothing for a moment, then, "Anything that affects operations, I need to know." "It doesn't affect operations." Juan held his eyes for a beat longer than comfortable. "All right." Min Jae drove back to the penthouse without security. He'd sent the car ahead and taken a cab, a thing he hadn't done in years, and sat in the back of a yellow cab driven by a man who spoke on a Bluetooth device the entire ride in a language Min Jae didn't recognize, and felt for the first time in a very long time completely anonymous. No one in the cab knew who he was. No one on the street they moved through knew who he was. The city continued its absolute indifference, and he sat inside it and felt something that was almost relief. Except relief implied the prior state had been worse, and he had not until this moment understood how heavy the prior state was. He thought about Nia on the subway. She'd done that. He'd learned it later, from the security log she didn't know existed, a detail that now struck him differently than it had when he'd first seen it. She'd taken the subway to Flatbush alone, 8 months pregnant, to look at an empty room above a dry cleaner. She'd done it deliberately. She'd done it because she needed to exist as a person in a city, not as a protected asset in a controlled environment. He hadn't understood that when he'd seen the log. He'd flagged it as a security concern. He understood it now, Shad. On the 3rd day after Nia left, Victor Lau made his move. It was not subtle, which told Min Jae something important about Lau's read of the situation. Subtle would have meant Lau was uncertain. The fact that it wasn't subtle meant someone had told him something. 2 of Min Jae's midtown operations, a legitimate import business used for specific financial arrangements and a parking structure whose revenue stream served a different purpose entirely, were visited within 4 hours of each other by men who identified themselves as representing a new management interest. They didn't threaten. They didn't damage anything. They simply arrived, spoke to the managers on duty, and left cards with a number on them and nothing else. Song called while Min Jae was still processing the morning. "Both locations," Song said. "Same day, 4-hour window. That's coordinated. That's a message. Who's his contact in the municipal system?" "Working on it, but boss..." Song paused in the way he paused when he had something to say that he wasn't sure how it would land. "The timing. Lau moving right now, this specific week. Somebody told him something." Min Jae was quiet. "I'm not saying it's internal," Song said quickly. "I'm saying the timing is specific. Pull the access logs for the last 3 weeks, everyone who had visibility on the midtown positions." "That's a short list." "Then it shouldn't take long." He spent the afternoon in the operations room on the lower level of a building in Long Island City that appeared from the outside to be an architecture firm. The room had no windows. It had 4 monitors, a secure line, and a table that had held so many long nights it had developed a permanent ring-stain geography that the cleaning staff knew better than to try to remove. By 6 in the evening, Song had a name. Min Jae looked at it for a long time. The name was Park Sung-ho. He'd been with the organization for 11 years. He ran a section of the financial architecture that touched both the import business and the parking structure. He had a wife and 2 daughters in Queens and a mother in Incheon he sent money to every month, and he had, apparently, also been providing selective information to Victor Lau's people for somewhere between 8 and 12 weeks. "How sure are you?" Min Jae said. "The access pattern is clear. He pulled both location files 4 days ago. No operational reason to touch both of those in the same session." "Has he been approached? By us?" "No. He doesn't know we're looking." Min Jae leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling, which was the same ceiling he had looked at during many difficult decisions, and thought about what the correct move was. In the old calculus the calculus that had gotten him to this position, that had built the thing he'd spent 15 years building, the answer was clean and fast and sent a message that would cost him nothing in the short term, and purchase significant deterrence in the medium term. He had made that calculation before, many times. He had executed on it without material hesitation. He sat with it longer than usual. "Where is he now?" Min-jae said. "Office. Still logged in. Call him in." "Tonight?" "Tonight, sir." Park Sung-ho arrived 40 minutes later with the expression of a man who had been told only that the boss wanted to see him and had spent the 40-minute drive manufacturing reasons why this might be routine. He was 53, heavy-set, with the kind of face that had once been open and had gradually closed over the years into something more careful. He'd always been careful. That was one of the reasons Min-jae had trusted him with the financial architecture. He sat across from Min-jae at the table. Song was by the door. No one else. Min-jae put a single sheet of paper on the table between them. The access log, Park's credentials at the top, the 2 file timestamps visible, the cross-reference to Lau's known operational addresses at the bottom. Park looked at it. His breathing changed, not dramatically, but enough. A slight deepening, the kind your body does when it's beginning to prepare for something. "I want to understand it," Min-jae said. "Not punish it. Understand it." Park looked up from the paper. His eyes moved to Song, then back to Min-jae. "How much did they offer you?" Min-jae said. A long silence. Park's jaw moved like he was working through something that had been lodged there. "It wasn't money," Park said finally. Min-jae waited. "My daughter." Park's voice was flat, controlled by effort. "The older one. She works for a firm in Midtown, corporate law. She's been there 4 years. He stopped, started again. "Lau's people approached her 6 months ago, told her they knew things about the firm's clients that could damage her career, that they'd go to the bar association." He looked at the table. "She doesn't know anything about my work. She doesn't know what I do. She built something clean. She worked for it." Min-jae said nothing. "They told me 3 pieces of information. That's all they asked for. 3. I gave them 2. He looked up. "I didn't give them the 3rd. "What was the 3rd? Park met his eyes. "Your home address and your wife's schedule." The room was very still. Min-jae felt something move through him that started cold and arrived somewhere hotter. He kept his face neutral with the discipline of a man who had spent 15 years making his face do what he told it to. "They asked for Naya," he said. "They asked for her pattern, where she went, when she was alone." Park's hands were flat on the table. "I didn't give it. They gave me a deadline. I missed it. That's when they moved on the Midtown positions. Retaliation for the miss." "Why didn't you come to me?" "Because I didn't know if coming to you would protect my daughter or put her in a different kind of danger." Park's voice cracked at the edge of the last word. "Not much, but enough. She's 29. She has nothing to do with any of this." Min-jae stood up from the table. He walked to the far wall and stood with his back to the room for a moment. Song watched him. When he turned back, his voice was even. "Your daughter's situation is going to be handled," he said. "By morning, Lau's leverage is gone. Do you understand me?" Park stared at him. "I need to know exactly who approached her, where, and what was said." Min-jae came back to the table and sat down. "Everything. Start from the beginning." It took an hour. By the end of it, Min-jae had 4 names and a clear understanding of the mechanism Lau had used, not just with Park, but with at least 2 other people inside the organization whose exposure had not yet been identified. Lau was not simply taking territory. He was dismantling from the inside, selectively and patiently, using the people Min-jae trusted most and the things they loved most. He had been doing it for 6 months, and he had asked for Nia's schedule. By midnight, Song had the full picture assembled. Lau's operation was more sophisticated than the Midtown moves had suggested. Those had been deliberately crude, a distraction, something visible to draw attention while the real work continued elsewhere. The real work was the network of pressure being applied to 6 people inside Min-jae's organization, each of them leveraged through something personal, each of them providing partial information that, assembled correctly, gave Lau a detailed map of Min-jae's infrastructure. "He's been building this for the better part of a year," Song said. "Who does he have on the financial side?" "Park was the primary, maybe one more. I'm still pulling threads." And the ask for Naya, that was his idea or someone else's? Song's expression changed slightly. We think it came from above Lao. Minjae looked at him. Lao has a backer, Song said. Someone who's been funding the expansion. We don't have a name yet, but the money has a shape to it. The amount, the structure. It's not street money. It's institutional. Institutional meaning what? Meaning someone who decided that the most effective way to destabilize your operation wasn't to hit the business. It was to hit what you'd protect. Song paused. They did their research. They knew your wife was... He stopped. Say it. They knew she was the thing you'd burn everything down for. The thing you'd burn everything down for. Minjae sat with that sentence. He thought about the letter in his shirt pocket. He thought about a woman in an apartment 2 blocks from a studio on Caton Avenue, sleeping in a bed he'd never seen, in a room she'd chosen herself, carrying their child in the final weeks before everything would change again. She had left him in order to survive the life he'd built. She had removed herself from the blast radius, and someone had been tracking her schedule. He stood up. I need her moved, he said. Tonight, without her knowing it's me. Song blinked. She won't accept protection from... It can't come from me. Talk to the building manager. Frame it as a neighborhood safety initiative. Whatever you have to say. I want 2 people on that block who are not in her line of sight and do not approach her under any circumstances. Minjae's voice was steady, but something behind it was not. She left because she needed to be free of this. I am not giving her life back and then letting someone use it against her. Song was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded. And Lao? He said. Minjae looked at him. We're going to find the backer first. Lao is a symptom. I want the source. That's going to take time. I know. And if they move on her while we're... They won't. Minjae's jaw set. Because if anything happens to her, there is no organization left for anyone to take. You understand? There is nothing left. I will burn every structure we have built to the ground before I let that happen. Song looked at him for a long time. In 15 years, he had heard Minjae speak with cold authority, with calculated menace, with the specific and surgical language of a man who had learned to use words the way other men used weapons. He had never heard him speak like this, with something underneath the authority that had no strategy in it, no calculation, nothing positioned for effect, just the raw, unmediated truth of a man who had finally located what he was actually afraid of losing. Okay, boss, Song said quietly. Minjae put on his coat, picked up his phone, Shoten, looked at it for a moment. He could call her. He could tell her. He could appear at the apartment on Caton Avenue with the truth about Lao and the backer and the person who had asked for her schedule and give her every reason to let him back into the space she'd built without him. He stood there with the phone in his hand and understood that this exact moment, was the test of whether he had actually changed or whether he was simply willing to change the packaging when the situation called for it. Because using this information to insert himself back into her life would be the old calculus. It would be making her safety a lever. It would be exactly the kind of move she had left him to escape. He put the phone back in his pocket. He would protect her. From a distance. Without her knowing. Without asking anything in return. Not because it was strategically correct, because it was the first genuinely unselfish thing he could think of to do for her, and he was not certain he was capable of it, and the uncertainty itself told him something important about the man he had been. He walked out into the night and got into the waiting car and told the driver to take him back to the penthouse. The penthouse that now had deliberate gaps in a closet and a letter folded in his shirt pocket and a nightstand where a wedding ring used to be, and sat in the back seat in the dark and tried to remember the last time he had done something for Nia that cost him something real. He was still trying to remember when the car reached the building. The answer, when it finally came to him somewhere between the lobby and the 41st floor, was worse than he expected. He stepped off the elevator and stood in the entryway of the penthouse and looked at the life he had assembled. The art on the walls, the city beyond the glass, the machinery of comfort and security and controlled beauty, and felt it for what it was for the first time. A monument to his own preferences, built with complete confidence and nearly total inattention to the woman who had been asked to live inside it. He went to the bedroom. He sat on her side of the bed. He put his hand flat on the pillow where she used to sleep and felt the specific quality of that particular absence and understood, with the clarity that only arrives when everything else has been stripped away, that the empire was not the thing he had spent 15 years building. She was. And he had built her in the wrong direction entirely, not toward herself, but toward him. And she had understood this before he did, and she had done the one thing he had never anticipated from anyone in his world. She had walked away without anger, without ultimatum, without asking him for anything except the space to become what she already was. Outside, two of Song's people were taking up positions on Keton Avenue. Inside the penthouse, the Korean Mafia Boss, who had never lost, sat on his wife's side of the bed with his hand on her pillow and faced the specific and irrevocable knowledge that losing was exactly what he had done. Not tonight, not when he'd read the letter, but slowly, incrementally, across 1,000 moments he hadn't been present for, in the accumulated weight of every time he had chosen the Empire over the woman who had loved him anyway. There was no enemy to neutralize for this. There was no position to reinforce, no leverage to apply, no call to make that would restructure the situation in his favor. There was only the question of what kind of man he intended to be from this point forward, and the terrifying, clarifying knowledge that for the first time in 15 years, the answer to that question belonged entirely to him. He didn't sleep. He sat at the desk in the study with the city going gray outside, and his phone face down in front of him, and thought about the name they didn't have yet, the backer behind Lau, the person whose money had the institutional shape Song described, the person who had looked at Min Jae's empire and decided the most efficient point of entry was a pregnant woman's daily schedule. By 4 in the morning, he had a working theory. It wasn't based on evidence yet. It was based on 15 years of reading the architecture of how people came for you. The angles they chose, the timing, the specific texture of the ambition involved. Taking midtown positions was territorial. Using leverage against internal people was methodical. But asking for Naya's schedule, that was personal. That was someone who understood that Min Jae Kong's organization could absorb territorial loss and could survive internal compromise, but could not function if the man at the center of it was destabilized at the level of the thing he actually cared about. Someone who knew him, not professionally, personally. He picked up his phone and called Song. "I need you to pull everything we have on James Wu," he said. Song was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. "James Wu is retired." "Pull it anyway." James Wu had been one of the 3 men present at the founding conversation of what eventually became Min Jae's organization, a dinner in a Flushing restaurant 14 years ago where 3 men had agreed on territories and structures and the specific terms of a partnership that had lasted 4 years before it fractured. The fracture had been over money, which was what fractures were always officially over, but underneath the money had been something else. Wu believed he had built the foundation that Min Jae had then built on top of, and that the credit and the control had distributed in a direction that didn't reflect that accurately. He hadn't been wrong. He also hadn't done anything about it. Not then. He'd taken his settlement, moved his operations to the West Coast, and disappeared from Min Jae's operational landscape so completely that Min Jae had stopped factoring him in years ago. That was the thing about people who were patient. They were easy to stop factoring in. "What makes you think Wu?" Song said. "The structure of the leverage. It's not about money. None of Lau's targets were offered enough money to matter. It's about finding the thing that makes a person feel like they have no choice. That's Wu's methodology. He used it on 3 people during the partnership years. I watched him do it." Min Jae paused. "And he's the only person from that period who knew about Nia before I went public with the relationship." Another silence from Song, longer this time. "If it's Wu, he's been planning this for a while. At least a year, maybe 2. That's..." Song stopped. "I know." "How do you want to handle it?" Min Jae looked at the window. Gray was becoming the first pale suggestion of actual morning. "I want confirmation first. Don't move on anything until I have confirmation." And Song, "Yeah." "Keton Avenue." "Both positions held all night, nothing moved." "Keep them there." He hung up and sat with the silence and the growing light and the specific weight of understanding that he had spent 14 years believing James Wu was finished with him, which was the same mistake he'd made with Naya, which was the same mistake he made with everything he'd decided was settled. He had confused the absence of visible conflict with the absence of conflict entirely. He was done making that mistake. Confirmation came at noon, and it came in a form he hadn't anticipated. Song called from a number Min-jae didn't recognize, which was the protocol for when something needed to be said on a line that had no history. "It's Wu," Song said. "No question." "What did you find?" "The money trail into Lau's operation runs through a holding entity incorporated in Delaware 14 months ago. The registered agent is a law firm in Seattle. The firm has represented Wu's Pacific interests for 9 years. Song's voice had the flatness of someone delivering information they're still processing themselves. "But that's not the thing." Min-jae waited. "Wu has a meeting tonight. In the city. We picked it up through Lau's communications. Lau doesn't know we're in his network yet. The meeting is at the Albemarle Club, private room, 7 o'clock. Song paused. "He's flying in this morning. He's been in New York for 2 days already, boss. He's been here the whole time." The Albemarle Club was 14 blocks from the penthouse. James Wu had been in New York for 2 days, 2 days that included the night Min-jae had stood at his window reading Naya's letter, 2 days that included the morning he'd sent Song to place people on Caton Avenue, 2 days of the most interior reckoning Min-jae had undergone in 15 years. And the man who had engineered the conditions for that reckoning had been 14 blocks away. "Who's in the meeting?" Min-jae said. "Lau. 2 others we don't have full IDs on yet, and—" Song stopped. "Song. A city councilman named Bridges, Derek Bridges. He sits on the Public Safety Subcommittee." Min-jae closed his eyes for exactly 3 seconds. Derek Bridges had been a reliable municipal contact for 6 years, not in Song's operational sense, but in the sense of someone who understood that stable neighborhoods served everyone's interests and who had accepted, on 2 occasions, contributions to his re-election campaign through channels that were technically legal and functionally clear about what they represented. If Bridges was in that room tonight, Wu wasn't just coming for the organization's territory. He was coming for the civic infrastructure that kept the organization operating within its particular zone of tolerance. He was coming for everything. "I'll be at the Albemarle at 7, Min-jae said. "Boss, if Wu sees you there, he'll know that I know, yes. That's going to accelerate whatever he's planning. It's already accelerated. He's in the same city as my wife, and he asked for her schedule." Min-jae's voice dropped to something quiet and very cold. "I'm done waiting for him to move." He arrived at the Albemarle at 6:40, not through the front, through a service entrance on the side street that he'd used exactly once before, 8 years ago, for a different kind of meeting in a different kind of crisis. The man who managed the club's private event floor owed Min-jae a specific and substantial favor that had never been called in, and Min-jae called it now with 3 words: private room access. He was in position outside the room's secondary entrance at 6:50. At 7:03, he heard Wu's voice for the first time in 11 years. It was recognizable immediately. The specific cadence of a man who had always believed he was the smartest person in any given room, which sometimes he was, and who had never entirely learned to modulate that belief into something more socially functional. It came through the door as a low, considered murmur, pausing for effect at intervals in the way of someone who had rehearsed the broad shape of the conversation. Min-jae stood outside the door with his hand flat against the wood and his heart doing something that was not quite what it usually did, not the elevated but controlled rhythm of professional high-stakes situations, but something with more heat in it, something that lived below the level of strategy. He pushed the door open and walked in. The room had 4 people in it. Lau, compact, 50s, the specific stillness of a man caught completely off guard, fighting to not look caught. And 2 men Min-jae didn't recognize who were almost certainly not there for the conversation, and almost certainly were there for the eventuality that a conversation became something else. And Bridges, who turned white in a way that had nothing to do with complexion. And James Wu. Wu was 61 and had aged in the direction of a certain kind of elegance, Silver at the temples, well-cut suit, the practiced ease of someone who had spent a decade convincing himself and others that he'd moved on to legitimate enterprise. He looked at Min-jae with an expression that moved through surprise and arrived at something that was almost, underneath all the composure, satisfaction. Min-jae, he said, like they were at a class reunion. James, you found the meeting. Wu tilted his head slightly. I underestimated your response time. You overestimated your access log security. Wu absorbed that. His composure held, but something shifted behind his eyes. A recalculation, rapid and invisible to anyone who didn't know how to look for it. Min-jae knew how to look for it. He'd watched this man do it across a table for 4 years. Sit down, Wu said. I'll stand. The two men he didn't recognize had moved, subtly, the way trained people move when a room changes configuration, redistributing toward positions that covered both entrances. Min-jae clocked them without moving his eyes from Wu. You came alone, Wu said. I came to talk. Then talk. Min-jae looked at Bridges first. The councilman had the expression of a man experiencing several kinds of regret simultaneously. Derek, Min-jae said simply, you should leave. Bridges left. He didn't look at Wu. He didn't look at Lau. He walked to the door at a pace that was trying not to be a run and failed slightly at the end, and the door closed behind him, and Min-jae turned back to Wu. You asked for my wife's schedule, Min-jae said. I asked for information, Wu said. Standard intelligence gathering. Her schedule, her location, when she was alone. Oh, you've always conflated business and personal, Min-jae. That was your weakness in the partnership years, too. She's 8 months pregnant. I'm aware. The two words landed in the room, and Min-jae let them land and did not respond for a moment, because the response that was available to him right then, the one that was honest, that reflected the actual interior temperature of what he was feeling, was not a response that would serve what needed to happen in this room tonight. What do you want, James? He said. Wu settled back in his chair with the ease of someone who has been waiting for a specific question for a long time. The West Side financial architecture, full transfer, the municipal relationships, whatever you have with Bridges and anyone else in that tier, and the Long Island City Operations Center, which you think I don't know about, but I've known about for 3 years. That's everything. Not everything. You keep the outer borough positions, the Brooklyn and Queens territories. I have no interest in those. He paused. Think of it as a negotiated divestiture. And if I decline? Wu looked at him steadily. You have 5 people inside your organization right now who are under active leverage. 2 of them have access to financial records that, in the wrong hands, would interest federal investigators considerably. I have a contact at the relevant agency who is, let's say, professionally curious. He spread his hands in a gesture that was almost apologetic. I've been building this for 14 months, Min-jae. It's thorough. I know how long you've been building it. Then you know it's finished. Wu's voice was even, reasonable. The voice of someone offering terms after a battle that's already been decided. This is the part where smart men make the trade and walk away intact. Min-jae looked at him for a long moment. He thought about Song outside the building with 4 people and a very specific set of instructions. He thought about Park Sung-ho's daughter, whose leverage Wu still believed was operational. He thought about Bridges walking out of the room just now, which meant the municipal relationship had just been severed from Wu's plan. Not because Bridges was loyal to Min-jae, but because Bridges was loyal to Bridges, and Bridges had just seen that the room was more complicated than advertised. He thought about Nia on Catan Avenue. The 5 people under leverage, Min-jae said. You're going to release them. Wu blinked. I'm sorry? The leverage. The daughters, the mothers, the careers being held over people's heads. You're going to release all of it, tonight. Wu's composure shifted for the first time into something more genuine, which was amusement. Min-jae, because if you don't, Min-jae continued, and his voice was quiet in the specific way it got when he was most serious, not loud, not theatrical, just leveled down to something that carried without needing volume. I'm going to hand the federal agency you just mentioned a complete dossier on the Delaware entity, the Seattle law firm, 14 months of financial records for Lau's operation, and a detailed account of extortion conducted against private citizens who had no involvement in any criminal enterprise. He paused. Conducted by you. The room was very still. Lau had gone carefully neutral. The two men by the walls were watching Wu. You'd burn your own operation, Wu said. I'd burn the parts that can't survive sunlight. I've been considering doing that anyway. He held Wu's eyes. You spent 14 months learning about my organization. You forgot to learn about the last 3 weeks. Something shifted in Wu's face. Not the recalculation. That was too fast, too practiced. This was something slower. The specific and unpleasant experience of realizing that the opponent you've been positioning against has been moving on a different board than the one you were watching. You're bluffing, Wu said, but the certainty was gone from under it. James. Min-jae said the name with the exhausted familiarity of someone addressing someone they once knew well and now mostly pity. I have been building things and protecting things and calculating the correct move in every situation for 15 years. I'm very good at it. You know that better than most people. He took a breath. I'm also tired of it. I'm tired of every conversation being a negotiation and every relationship being an asset and every morning starting with a threat assessment. He looked at Wu and felt something he hadn't expected to feel in this room, which was a kind of clarity, the same clarity that had come to him on the edge of Nia's side of the bed with his hand on her pillow. You came here thinking you understood what I would protect and what I would sacrifice. You don't. You understood who I was a year ago. I don't fully recognize that person anymore. Wu studied him. The leverage, Min-jae said. Release it, tonight. And take Lau and whatever you've built and go back to the West Coast and stay there. And I will not hand that dossier to anyone, and whatever version of retirement you've been performing out there can continue indefinitely. He paused. Or don't, and find out what I'm willing to burn. The silence stretched. Lau shifted in his seat. One of the men by the wall coughed. Wu's jaw moved slightly, that same processing gesture, the working through of something lodged, and Min-jae watched it and waited and did not fill the silence, because he had learned across 15 years that the most powerful thing you could do in a negotiation was let the other person sit inside their own calculation without relief. The park girl, Wu said finally. The lawyer. She's already been released. We pulled that leverage 2 days ago. He said it without looking up. It was going to expire anyway. She didn't have anything useful. The others. Tonight. He said it the way men say things they've decided in the last 30 seconds that they intend to present as having been considered longer. By midnight. Min-jae nodded once. He turned toward the door. Min-jae. He stopped, didn't turn. You're not the same, Wu said. You're right about that. I don't know what happened to you in the last 3 weeks, but you're different. A pause. She must be something. Min-jae didn't answer. He pushed the door open and walked out into the corridor, and didn't stop moving until he was through the service entrance and in the side street, where the night air hit him and he stood against the building wall and breathed. Actually breathed. The way you do when you've been holding something for hours without realizing it. The long exhale of a man who has been underwater and has just broken the surface. Song was at the end of the alley. Well, Song said, it's done. Min-jae straightened off the wall. Get me confirmation on the leverage releases by midnight, all 5 people. And Wu? He's going home. Song looked at him carefully. You gave him a pass. I gave him an exit. Min-jae started toward the street. There's a difference. Is there? Min-jae stopped, turned. Song was watching him with the expression he sometimes wore when he was deciding whether to say the true thing or the manageable thing. Say it, Min-jae said. The old version of you, Song said carefully, doesn't give James Wu an exit. Not after the ask on Nia's schedule. Not after 14 months of infrastructure dismantling. He paused. The old version ends this conversation differently. I know. So what does this version end it with? Min-jae looked at the street beyond the alley. The ordinary nighttime street, cabs and pedestrians, and the specific ambient light of a city that never fully darkened. With the ability to look at my kid someday and not have to explain away this particular night, he said. Song was quiet. Drive me to Caton Avenue, Min-jae said. Song went very still. You're going to... Drive me to Caton Avenue. I'm not going in. I just need to. He stopped. The sentence didn't have a clean ending. I just need to see that she's okay. They drove in silence through the Brooklyn streets. The studio was dark at this hour, closed, the windows unlit, the new signage on the front visible under the streetlight, painted letters that Nia had chosen, the kind that looked careful rather than expensive. Below the studio, a light was on in the second-floor apartment window. A warm light. The kind that meant a lamp was on inside, which meant someone was awake or had fallen asleep with the lamp on, which for a woman 8 months pregnant was entirely possible. Min-jae sat in the car and looked at the lit window. He did not get out. He sat with the specific and difficult feeling of a man who is in the right place for the wrong kind of arrival, who has earned nothing yet, who has only just begun the work that needed to begin years ago, who has no claim on the warmth visible in that window except the claim of the person he is trying to become rather than the person he has been. He looked at the light for a long time. Then he said, "Take me home." Song drove. Min-jae sat in the back without speaking, watching Brooklyn give way to Manhattan, the bridge lights moving overhead in their familiar sequence, the city assembling itself in the window glass and then dissolving as the car turned toward the penthouse block. His phone buzzed. A message from Song's secondary contact, the first of the 5 leverage releases confirmed. A family in Queens notified that the pressure was gone. A daughter in Midtown who would go to work tomorrow without knowing how close something had come. He read it and felt something that was not satisfaction. Satisfaction implied a comfortable endpoint, and he understood now, with a clarity he hadn't had 3 weeks ago, that there were no comfortable endpoints, only the ongoing work of being different than you were. The car stopped in front of the building. He didn't move immediately. He sat and thought about what waited in the penthouse. The gaps in the closet, the letter in his pocket, the nightstand with the absent ring, the apartment that had been built for a life he'd assembled without consultation. And thought about what he was going to do differently starting now, not as a strategy to get something back, but as the necessary work of becoming the kind of person who deserved to have it. He thought about a woman with paint on her sleeve sitting on a dusty floor in an empty room, feeling like herself for the first time in too long. He thought about what it meant that she had done that alone. He thought about what it would mean to stand beside her, not in front of her, not behind her, not as the reason she existed in any given room, but beside her, as someone who understood that her existence was not contingent on his presence and was precisely the more valuable for it. His phone buzzed again. Second release confirmed. He got out of the car. He rode the elevator to the 41st floor and walked into the penthouse and stood in the entryway for a moment in the dark, not turning on the lights. Somewhere across the city, in an apartment above an art studio on Caton Avenue, the woman he had loved insufficiently was awake or almost asleep, carrying their child in the final days before the world would expand by one more person, a person who would need both of them to be more than they had been. He took Nia's letter out of his pocket. He unfolded it on the kitchen table and read it one more time, the 5th or 6th time now, he'd lost count. And when he got to the postscript, to the 4 words she'd written at the end with the precise economy of someone who had found the exact right sentence for the exact right moment, he felt something move through his chest that he was not going to name because naming it would make it smaller. Life goes on, Min-jae. He folded the letter and put it back in his pocket. He went to the desk in the study and took out a single sheet of paper and wrote 4 lines in his own handwriting. Not a response, not a request, not a negotiation. Just 4 lines that said what was true. He would not send it tonight. He had not earned tonight. But he would send it when he had, and in the meantime he would do the work. The quiet, unspectacular daily work of being a man worth returning to. And he would do it without asking her to witness it, without using it as leverage, without turning his own change into a claim on her patience. He folded the paper. Put it in the same drawer as a locked box that held a letter she'd written him years ago, in the first year of their marriage, when the world had seemed simpler, or perhaps they had simply been less honest about its complexity. He locked the drawer. He went to bed on his own side. He lay in the dark and thought about all the things he still didn't know how to do. How to be present without control, how to love someone without making that love into a structure they had to live inside, how to show up for a person's actual life rather than the version of their life that was convenient for him. And he thought about the fact that not knowing how to do something had never, in his entire life, been sufficient reason not to begin. Outside, the city continued. On Caton Avenue, the light in the second-floor window eventually went out, and somewhere in the dark, between two people who had loved each other imperfectly and were both still alive, something was waiting. Not resolution, not reunion, not the clean narrative of a man who changed and was rewarded for it, but the more difficult and more honest possibility of two people who had each done the work of becoming themselves and might, if both of them were willing, find their way back to each other from a place of genuine equality rather than the imbalance that had nearly cost them everything. The penthouse was quiet. The letter was in his pocket. The light on Caton Avenue was out. And Kang Min-jae, who had spent 15 years being afraid of nothing, lay in the dark and felt the specific and unfamiliar weight of a man who has finally identified what he's afraid of losing, and who understands, with a clarity that has come too late and perhaps just in time, that the only way to keep it is to deserve it. The baby came on a Tuesday. Not dramatically. Not with the cinematic urgency of a moment that announces itself. No storm outside. No symbolic rupture in the ordinary run of the day. It came the way most true things come. Quietly, without warning, in the middle of a morning that had started like every other morning, with Nia awake before 6 because sleep in the final days had become a negotiation she mostly lost, standing at the window of the apartment above the studio, watching the street below come alive in its gradual Flatbush way. The first delivery truck, the woman who walked her dog at the same time every day, the dry cleaner below beginning the process of opening. Her water broke at 6:42 while she was making tea. She stood in the kitchen for a moment with her hand on the counter and felt the specific quality of a threshold, the understanding that everything before this moment and everything after it would be organized around what was about to happen, that the person she had been up until 6:42 on this Tuesday was about to expand in a direction that couldn't be undone or reconsidered. She called her friend Camille first. Camille had been designated as her labor support, a decision made weeks ago with the clear-eyed practicality of a woman preparing for a major event without the certainty of who else would be present. Camille answered on the second ring and said she was 20 minutes away and to start timing. Then Nia stood in the kitchen with one hand on the counter and one hand on her stomach and looked at her phone. She called Min-jae. It rang 4 times. She was already composing the voicemail in her mind. Short, factual, the information delivered without pressure or implication, when he picked up. "Naya." His voice was immediate, present, the voice of someone who had not been asleep. "It's time," she said. A silence that lasted less than a second. "I'm on my way." She didn't tell him he didn't need to come. She had prepared that sentence, had rehearsed a version of it in her head during the weeks of the separation, the version that was fair and clear and set appropriate limits. She didn't say it. She hung up instead and went to get her bag, which had been packed for 11 days. He arrived at the hospital 14 minutes after she did. She knew this because Camille told her, having been in the waiting area when he came through the entrance, alone, no security, in the clothes of a man who had been awake and dressed for hours, but had not been expecting today to be today. Camille described it later as the look of a man running toward something rather than away from it, which she said she'd never seen from him in the 2 years she'd known Nia to be with him. He was not allowed in the room immediately. The early labor was Nia's to manage in the way she'd planned, and Camille was there, and the hospital staff moved with the unhurried efficiency of people who had done this 10,000 times, and understood that the drama involved was enormous to the people inside it and routine to everyone else. He sat in the waiting area. Nia knew he was there. The knowing of it did something complicated to her. Not a reopening of what had closed, not a reversal of the weeks of solitary work she'd done to become the person currently breathing through contractions with intention rather than panic. It was more like the specific comfort of knowing that a thing you had been uncertain about had resolved itself in a particular direction, and the direction, while not simple, was the honest one. She had not called him because she needed him to be there. She had called him because he was the father of this child, and she had promised herself, in the clearest terms she could find, that her anger at the husband would never become the child's experience of the father, that the two things would be kept separate, that whatever she and Min-jae were to each other going forward, The child would not grow up inside the wreckage of that question. She had called him because it was right, not because it was easy. Labor ran 9 hours. He was in the room for the last 2, standing at the edge of where he'd been told to stand, not filling the space the way he usually filled spaces, not with authority or presence or the specific gravity that arranged itself around him in professional contexts, but with something quieter and less certain, the specific posture of a man who understands he is present on someone else's terms and is grateful for the terms. He didn't talk much. When he did, it was direct and useful. Water, ice chips, a hand when she reached without looking to see whose it was. She reached twice. The second time she held on longer than the first, and he did not move, did not shift, did not give any indication that his hand was doing anything other than exactly what she needed it for. At 4:17 in the afternoon, a girl arrived. She came into the world with the specific outrage of someone who has been somewhere warm and contained and has had that arrangement unilaterally terminated. A cry that was less sound than declaration, full-throated and absolute and already entirely itself. Nia heard it and felt every muscle in her body release something she hadn't known she'd been holding for 9 months. Min-jae made a sound she had never heard from him. It was not a word. It was the sound a person makes when something happens that no amount of preparation actually prepares you for. A sharp exhale that was almost a laugh and was also, underneath, something that had nothing to do with laughter. The nurse placed the baby on Nia's chest. The baby stopped crying almost immediately, like she recognized the heartbeat, like she'd been listening to it from the inside for 8 months and found it now and decided that was sufficient. Nia looked down at her daughter and felt the world reorganize itself permanently around this new fact. She looked up. Min-jae was standing where she'd last seen him, but his face had changed completely. Not performing anything, not managing anything, not organized into any of the configurations she'd learned to read over 3 years of marriage. Just open. The word that came to her was cracked open, which was different from broken, which was different from healed. It was the face of a man in the middle of something he could not control and had stopped trying to. "Hi," she said to him quietly, not meaning it as a greeting exactly. He came closer. He looked at the baby on her chest. His hand moved, almost involuntarily, the way hands move when the body is ahead of the mind, and hovered for a moment before Nia nodded, and he placed it gently on the baby's back, his whole palm covering most of her small body. Neither of them said anything for a while. They named her Seo Yeon. Nia had chosen it, a name that was both of their heritages without being only one of them, a name that belonged to the girl herself before it belonged to either parent's story. She had decided it weeks before, working alone in the apartment, and when she told Min-jae in the hospital room with the baby sleeping in the clear-sided bassinet between them, he said it once quietly, testing the weight of it, and nodded. "It's right," he said. "I know." They talked for an hour that evening, which was the first real conversation they'd had since the night she'd told him about the studio, and he'd said I should have been there. Not a negotiation, not an accounting of grievances. Something more careful than either of those things. Two people who had known each other for years and had recently been exposed to more honest versions of each other than the versions they'd been performing, sitting in the specific exhaustion of a day that had reorganized everything. "I should tell you something," Min-jae said at one point. He was in the chair beside her bed, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. She waited. He told her about Wu, about the 14 months of infrastructure dismantling, about the leverage applied to people inside his organization through the things they loved, about the ask for her schedule, her location, when she was alone, her daily pattern. She listened without interrupting. Her face moved through several things. Surprise, then the colder recognition of what the information meant, then something that was not quite anger but lived in anger's neighborhood. "They were watching me," she said. "Yes. While I was..." She looked at the bassinet. "While I was doing all of it, the studio, the apartment, they were tracking it." "They were trying to. They didn't get what they needed." He paused. "I had people on your block. From the night I found your letter. You didn't know." She was quiet for a long time. Outside the hospital room, the hallway had the nighttime sound of a floor settling into its quieter shift. Lower voices, softer footsteps, the particular hush of a place that runs continuously but acknowledges the hour. "You protected me without telling me," she said. "You had the right to be free of my world. You still have that right. I was trying to—" He stopped, looked at his hands. "I was trying to do one thing correctly, without making it about what I would get back." She studied him. The specific study of someone who has learned to look past the surface of this person toward the reality underneath, which is different from what the surface shows and always has been. "Did it work?" she asked. "Wu is gone. The leverage on the internal people has been released." He looked up. "The organization is going to change. I've been thinking about what I said at the Meridian, what you heard. I've been thinking about it every day since I found your letter." "What do you think when you think about it?" "I think I said it because I believed it. Not because I didn't love you. I did. I do." His voice had the texture of something being said that has been carried for a while and is finally being set down. "I believed it because I had stopped treating you as a person who was separate from me and had started treating you as a part of the structure, something given, something that didn't require tending because it was already there." He paused. "That's not love." I said the word and did a different thing. She didn't reply immediately. The baby made a small sound in the bassinet, not crying, just the sound of something alive and newly arrived, registering the environment. "I know you've changed," Nia said finally. "I can see it. I don't doubt that part." She looked at him carefully. "What I don't know yet is what that means for us." "I know. I'm not coming back to the penthouse. Not yet. Maybe not. I know, Nia. The studio is mine. That's not negotiable." "It shouldn't be. It's one of the best things I've ever watched you build." She looked at him with the expression she sometimes wore when he said something that landed unexpectedly correctly, the slight adjustment of features that meant she was deciding whether to let it matter. She let it matter. A little. "I need time," she said. "Take it. And I need you to be her father, fully, consistently, not as a performance and not because you're trying to earn something from me, because she deserves that independently." "She does." He looked at the bassinet, at Seo Yan sleeping with the absolute abandon of someone who has not yet learned to hold anything back. "I know she does." They sat in the room for a while longer without speaking, and the silence between them was not the hollow silence of the car ride from the Meridian Gala or the managed silence of a dinner where one person was mostly somewhere else. It was the silence of two people who had run out of the things that needed to be said tonight and had arrived at the point where presence was sufficient. He left at 10. He didn't ask to stay. He kissed Seo-yeon's head once, carefully, the way you touch something that requires a different kind of care than anything you've touched before, and said goodnight to Nia, and she said goodnight back, and he walked out, and she listened to his footsteps diminish in the corridor and then looked at her daughter and thought that this was the beginning of something, the shape of which she couldn't fully see yet, and that not being able to fully see it was not the same as it being wrong. The months that followed were not a restoration. They were a construction, something new being built from the materials of the old, which meant the materials were real and tested, but also meant they needed to be worked differently than they had been before. Min-jae came to the apartment on Caton Avenue on Tuesday and Thursday mornings. He arrived at 9 and left by noon. He brought coffee for Nia without being asked, because he had learned exactly how she took it. A piece of knowledge so simple it embarrassed him that it had required this much to surface. He held Seo-yeon with the careful attention of a man who is learning something that matters more than anything he has previously learned, which was exactly what he was. He did not ask about the future. He did not press for a timeline. He understood, in the way he had learned to understand things this year, from the inside rather than through analysis, that the trust being rebuilt was not the same as the trust that had been lost, and that treating it as a recovery rather than a construction would be the wrong frame. He had told Song in October that the organizational structure needed to change. Not immediately, not in the way of a man performing conversion for an audience, but progressively and genuinely, the way you restructure something when you've decided the original design had a fundamental flaw. Certain operations were transferred to legitimate enterprise. Two of the municipal relationships were severed, including one that would have survived any ordinary cost-benefit analysis, because what it represented was the particular flavor of influence Min Jae had decided he was no longer interested in holding. Song had watched all of this with the expression of a man who has known someone for a long time and is encountering a version of them he hadn't fully anticipated. "You're actually doing it," Song said in November. "I told you I was going to." "People say a lot of things." "I know." Min Jae looked at him. "I was one of those people." Song had nodded once, the nod of a man revising a long-held assessment, and had not brought it up again. The studio on Caton Avenue expanded in November. Nia hired 2 part-time teachers, a ceramicist from Crown Heights and a muralist who had grown up in the neighborhood and had strong opinions about what children needed to be trusted with in terms of materials and scale. The Saturday morning classes filled within a week of posting. She added a Wednesday afternoon session for older kids, teenagers who arrived with the defensive posture of people who had been told their whole lives that art was not for them, and who, over weeks of working with their hands, slowly lost the posture without noticing. She was good at this. She had always been good at this. The goodness was specific and practiced and had nothing to do with him. And when he watched it, on the 3 occasions she allowed him to come by the studio when classes were running, he felt something that was not pride exactly, because pride implied some claim on the thing being observed. It was something cleaner than pride, something more like recognition. The recognition of a quality you had failed to adequately account for and are now accounting for with the full weight it deserves. He did not tell her this. Some things needed to be done quietly, without the doing of them being announced. The winter exhibition was in December. Nia organized it herself, a Saturday evening showcase of student work, the studio walls covered with the accumulated evidence of 3 months of Saturday mornings and Wednesday afternoons. Paintings, collages, a ceramic series made by 3 siblings aged 7, 9, and 12 that had a wildness to it that suggested the teacher had known exactly how much to step back. The muralist had facilitated a collaborative piece on the largest wall, 12 feet wide, done by the Wednesday teenagers, depicting the neighborhood from above in a style that was simultaneously documentary and invented, which was, Nia thought, exactly right. There were 60-something people in the studio by 7 in the evening. Parents, community members, a few local figures who had heard about the program and come to see what it was. The energy had the specific warmth of a room full of people who are there because they genuinely want to be, not because they feel they should be. Seo Yan was in a carrier on Camille's chest, asleep with the thoroughness of a 4-month-old who has decided this is a nap rather than a social obligation. She had her father's tendency towards stillness when she was thinking about something, and her mother's habit of reaching for things with both hands at once, and she had her own specific face that belonged entirely to her and to no one else. Min Jae arrived at 7:15. He had not been invited specifically, but he had not been uninvited, and he had called in the morning to ask if it was all right to come, and Nia had said yes in the measured way she said yes to things she was still deciding the full implications of. He came alone. No security, no car waiting outside. He'd taken the subway, a thing he'd begun doing more of, quietly, because it returned him to the experience of being a person in a city rather than an authority moving through it. He stood near the entrance for a moment, taking in the room, the work on the walls, the people, the collaborative mural, which was immediately arresting in the way that work made without self-consciousness often is. He looked at it for a while. The neighborhood from above, the mixture of documentary and invented, children's hands having done something that demanded actual attention. Nia found him there. She was carrying a cup of coffee she'd been intending to drink for the last 20 minutes, and hadn't managed to. And she was wearing paint on her left forearm again, off-white, the same shade as the studio walls, which she'd touched up that morning. And she looked the way she had looked on the floor of the empty studio 8 months ago, before any of this had been built. Like herself, entirely, and without management. "You came," she said. "I came." He looked at the mural again. "This is extraordinary, Nia. The kids did it. That's what makes it extraordinary. She looked at him sideways. He was studying the work with the attention he usually reserved for problems that required solving, except this wasn't that kind of attention. It was the attention of someone who has found something genuinely surprising and is taking time with the surprise. "You've been on the subway," she said. He looked at her. "Song told you." "Song didn't have to. You're different on Tuesday mornings." She paused. "Less arranged." He thought about that. "I've been trying to remember what it feels like to be a person without the apparatus. How's that going?" Slowly. He held her eyes. "Honestly, it's harder than anything I've done professionally, which tells me something about how long I went without doing it." She nodded once, the nod she made when something landed that she'd been waiting to see land. Not satisfaction, more like the careful acknowledgement of something real. They stood together in front of the mural for a while. Around them, the room continued. Conversations, laughter, a child explaining his painting to someone with the seriousness of a person presenting a doctoral thesis. Camille came by with Seo Yeon, who had decided to be awake now and was regarding the room with the expansive interest of someone encountering large groups of people for the first time and finding them, on balance, acceptable. Min-jae took her when she reached for him, both hands, the way her mother reached, the way that was entirely her own. He held her against his chest, and she grabbed the collar of his jacket and held it with the grip strength that still surprised him every time, and looked at his face with the specific, focused attention of someone conducting an assessment. He looked back at her. Something moved across his face that Naya saw. Not performed, not managed. The thing she had seen in the hospital room, the cracked open thing that was not broken and not healed, but was honest in a way that was more valuable than either. "She looks like you when she's deciding something," he said. "She looks like you when she's already decided." He almost smiled. She did smile briefly before she caught it and let it settle into something quieter. The room moved around them. The exhibition continued. After a while, when Seo Yeon had been transferred back to Camille and the coffee Nia had been carrying was finally cold enough to be abandoned, they found themselves near the back of the studio, slightly outside the main density of the gathering. The window beside them looked out onto Caton Avenue, the street at night, the dry cleaner closed and dark below, the ordinary traffic moving in its ordinary pattern. "I have something for you," Min-jae said. He reached into his inside jacket pocket and took out a folded piece of paper. He held it for a moment before handing it over, and in that moment Nia saw his hand, the steadiness of it, which was habitual, and underneath the steadiness a quality she could only describe as exposed, which was not habitual at all. She took the paper and unfolded it. 4 lines. His handwriting, which she knew the way you know the handwriting of someone you've received things from. Careful, slightly angular. The handwriting of a person who does not write by hand often enough to have lost the self-consciousness of it. "I said life would go on. I was right about the fact and wrong about the meaning. I thought it meant you were replaceable. It meant I was already in the process of losing you and didn't know enough to be afraid. I know now. Whatever you decide, I'll have been worth knowing you. That's enough." She read it twice, the way he had read her letter. Not because the words changed, but because the second reading was for the layer beneath the first. She folded it and held it in her hand and looked out the window at Cotton Avenue and said nothing for a moment. The snow had started. Not heavily, the first proper snow of the season, the kind that falls without committing fully, testing the air. "The night of the gala," she said. "What I heard, I've thought about it every day." "I know. Not because it hurt me. Well, because it hurt me, but also because it was the truest thing I ever heard you say without meaning to." She turned from the window to look at him. "You really believed it. That was the part I couldn't get past. Not that you said it, that you believed it. I did believe it. And now?" He held her eyes. "Now I know what the life going on actually looks like. And I know that going on is not the same as continuing. I am continuing. What went on, what I had before you left. That's gone. That specific life is finished." He paused. "I don't say that so you'll come back. I say it because you asked me an honest question and I owe you the honest answer." She looked at him for a long time, long enough that a person less patient would have filled the silence and he did not fill it. He let it be what it was and waited inside it, which was itself a kind of evidence. "I'm not ready to come home," she said. "I know. I don't know when I will be, or if that's even the right frame." She looked at the paper in her hand. Home might look different than it did. It should. We'd have to build it again, from the beginning, differently. Yes. That's slow work. I know slow work, he said. I've been doing it since October. She almost smiled again. This time she let it stay a moment longer. Outside the window, the snow continued its tentative commitment to the evening. On the street below, a woman walked past holding a child's hand, both of them looking up at the falling snow with the specific upward-tilted attention of people who haven't decided yet whether to be pleased about the weather. Nia watched them. She thought about the night she had stood in a hallway at the Meridian Grand, with her hand pressed flat against marble, and heard 4 words that had taken everything she thought she understood and reorganized it permanently. She thought about the Tuesday morning she had found the studio, the floor light, and the walls needing paint, and the cracked window frame. She thought about signing the lease, moving the money, packing the bags while Min-jae slept, the wedding ring on the nightstand, the letter that said life goes on at the end of it, and the specific terrifying courage it had taken to mean it. She thought about the woman she had been before all of this, who had dreamed about a room full of children making things with their hands, and the woman she was now, who had built it, and the understanding that those 2 women were continuous, that the second was not a departure from the first, but an arrival. A long-delayed arrival at a place she had always been headed. She reached out and placed her hand in Min-jae's. Not a declaration, not a resolution, not the clean, culminating gesture of a story that is worked out. Just a hand in a hand, warm, present, belonging to 2 people who have been through something real and are standing on the other side of it, changed, imperfect, uncertain of much and certain of a few things, which is the most honest condition available to any human being. He looked down at their hands, then up at her. He didn't say anything. He understood. She saw that he understood. That this was not the ending of something and not the beginning of something, but the continuation of something that had always been more complicated and more worth having than either of them had known how to say. The exhibition wound down around them. People gathered their children and their coats. The mural on the wall remained, 12 feet wide, the neighborhood seen from above in its invented and documentary truth. Seo-yeon had fallen back asleep, indifferent to the adult geometries of the evening, managing her own requirements with the complete self-sufficiency of someone who has not yet learned to doubt herself. Camille caught Nia's eye across the room and raised an eyebrow. The eyebrow of a woman who has been watching a situation develop and has opinions about it that she will share tomorrow and not tonight. Nia looked back at her with the expression that meant, "I know, I'll tell you, not now." The last guests filtered out. Min-jae helped stack chairs. He did it without being asked, without it being significant. Just a man stacking chairs in a room that needed chairs stacked, one more thing that needed doing in the ordinary aftermath of a good evening, and the ordinariness of it was the most truthful version of the change that had occurred, because the old version of this man would not have been in this room stacking chairs, and the new version was here, and that was all. When it was done, he got his coat. At the door, he paused. "Next Tuesday," he said. 9 o'clock, she said. He nodded, stepped out into the snow which had made up its mind now and was coming down in the proper committed way of a season that has decided to begin. She watched him walk down Caton Avenue, alone, hands in his pockets, not moving the way he used to move, not with the authority that arranged the world around him, but with the unremarkable gait of a man going somewhere in the snow. She watched until he turned the corner. She went back inside and stood in the empty studio and looked at the children's work covering the walls, and the mural, and the office at the back where the lights were still on, and the window through which the snow was visible falling on the street below. She looked at her left hand. The wedding ring was not there. That was a question for another day, or another month, or the version of this story that had not yet been written and would be written in the way all honest things get written, slowly, with many revisions, by people who are doing their best with what they know and who they are. She turned off the lights. She locked the studio door she climbed the stairs to the apartment where Seo-yeon was sleeping in the room Nia had painted herself, in the crib she had assembled with instructions that required 3 attempts before they made sense, in the life she had built from scratch with her own hands and her own money, and the specific kind of courage that has no audience. She stood in the doorway of the baby's room and listened to Seo-yeon breathe. The breathing of someone new in the world. The breathing of someone who did not yet know that her father had stacked chairs in a studio in Brooklyn in the snow, or that her mother had signed a lease on an empty room and painted the walls herself, or that 2 people who had loved each other badly had spent a year learning what it would mean to love each other correctly. She didn't need to know yet. She only needed to breathe and sleep and reach for things with both hands in the morning, which she would, which they all would.